to Mr. Kanabar for his assessment of the conversations he's heard on the channel so far and what the rate structure is that's been finalized. Mr. Kanabar, satisfied with what's been decided by the GST Council today?
Yes and no. I'm really glad that the council came to an agreement on rates, because had they not come to an agreement on the rates today, it would have seriously challenged the implementation date of 1st April. It would have been almost impossible. So I'm glad we have had a sort of a consensus on the rate. And I would say no for a very simple reason, that precisely what you're talking about, assess. So we now have 4 rates and assess attached to it. In a sense, 5 rates, 0, 5%, 12, 18, 28, and then assess. An assess which will be there year on year on year. So in that sense, we are not really simplifying the position as it should be. But clearly, I'm glad that we are on the way to implementation on 1st April.
But Mr. Kanabar, you know, as far as this classification business is concerned, because there is still no clarity, a final decision is yet to be taken. But what our colleague Sapna is now reporting, for instance, and that was the indication that came in from the finance minister, it seems fairly certain that cars will come under the 28% bracket, as 12.5 is central excise, 14.5% is VAT. Similarly for SUVs, you know, as far as classification goes, how do you define what a luxury car will be and so on and so forth? What kind of classification challenges do you foresee? Because there's also a lot of talk on what will move out, for instance, from 28 to 18, what could be pushed up from 12 to 18 and so on and so forth.
I was hearing Pawan earlier, Mr. Pawan Goenka, talking about classification, and I would totally agree with him that luxury would need to be defined by value and cannot be defined merely by size. And again, what I heard the finance minister say is that if the current rate is higher than 28, then the difference would be made up by assess. So therefore, one is all cars and SUVs going to 28, and the cost inflation that it pushes up are negated to an extent by the fact that you get input credits which are totally fungible. So that's one basket, and one would need to do an impact analysis on that. But the second and the more important is that if the current rate of tax is say 45%, then the difference between 28 and 45% would be made up through assess. And that's the mechanism which I heard the finance minister talk about.
Yes, absolutely. That is the mechanism that the finance minister and the government is working with. Just again, on the point on small cars, as we've been pointing out, likely to fall under the 28% bracket, but that is largely unchanged for the sector, because at 12.5 is the current central excise and 14.5% is the VAT as of now. Let me bring in a quick word from Sachin Menon as well. Sachin, you know, sort of a mixed house there as far as the cess is concerned, but broadly in terms of rates and the impact and the implications, what do you see?
Well, I think it is a good news that there is a consensus on the rates at least. But as far as cess is concerned, perhaps it would have been fine had the government introduced a kind of bifurcation mechanism of the revenue which is collected from the tax, wherever cess is proposed, into 3 baskets in the ratio maybe whatever tax collected, instead of levying a cess. If the rate would have been increased by maybe 1% or 2% on these items, and the instead of the bifurcation formula, there could be a trifurcation formula which say that 45%, 45, 45, 10. And the 10% would have gone straight away to the compensation fund, would have a better mechanism rather than introducing a cess in addition to that. And the hazard of introducing the cess is that in this excuse, maybe tomorrow the government can propose a different kind of cesses on top of the GST, which in fact distort the GST principle itself.
Okay, Sachin.
Therefore, I would have been happy had the government had a different way of generating the
No, Sachin, actually, you know, your question is leading me to get another doubt. Now, if you want to re-rationalize, to be sure the secretaries and the bureaucrats will present their fitment of various products in various categories. Which is the body that will change these taxes? For instance, I mean, this obviously cannot be done in the union budget because indirect taxes is now out of the union budget. It will only be direct taxes that the union budget will have to worry about. It cannot tackle excise. It will be done by the GST Council. Will that be an annual affair? I'm not able to understand the process and the time and the body which will change the indirect taxes. Do you know do you have clarity on that?
It will be the GST Council, Lata.
No,
it will be the GST Council.
Will it be an annual, will it be an annual affair? Or will it be a quarterly affair, a monthly affair?
Likely to be or could even be more frequent.
Sure.
This was a question that we put to the Finance Ministry and the response was we haven't decided that yet, but it will be the GST Council. The frequency of the tinkering of the rates, if needed at all, will be something that is yet to be decided.
Oh, that means that will be year-long lobbying and year-long budget making.
Well, to my understanding, GST Council is a recommendatory authority. They don't have binding powers. Whatever may be those rates, etc., they can recommend. And this being a constitutional body, like Planning Commission, I think these suggestions or recommendations will be accepted by the state and central because it is coming from a kind of consensus among the state and center. And therefore, it would be accepted and implemented by the parliament as well as the respective assemblies in the states.
No, but Sachin,
So
that
that's
doesn't.
what my understanding
Sachin, that doesn't answer the question. And maybe Shireen, you want to jump in. My point is, let us assume that cars have been agreed to at 28%, and let us assume, the car manufacturers and SIAM have been able to convince various authorities that it should be in the 18% category. At what time does it become? As well, if the GST Council were convinced of it and there is a random meeting after 6 months of the GST Council where they agree, then how is it implemented? Will the bureaucratic council have to meet again, their back office committee, and then will all the states and the centre have to again legislate and pass that law? Is it that long a process to change from one category to another, Sachin?
I don't think that even today, if you see that there is something called a tariff rate and an effective rate under indirect tax. Now, when the tariff rates are kept high, the executive have the power to issue a notification to give an effective rate. So therefore, they have avoided going into the parliament every point in time. But I guess in the GST bill, I don't think that kind of provision is there. That means that whenever there is a change is required, then it could be recommended by the GST Council and then implemented by the state, whether it is through a notification or it is required to be passed in each of the assemblies and parliament. That matter yet to be clarified.
Sachin, sorry, Shireen, how do you understand this problem?
Yeah, that's it. This was the specific question that we actually put to the government, Lata, and the simple answer was, we don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. At least at this point in time, the frequency of when and how many times, whether this will be an annual revision, etc., I don't think that is quite clear. At least that was what was very candidly said to us. So I think, that they're just trying to put this structure in place before they start to address some of those other issues. But when we specifically asked whether this would be the rate revision would be an annual exercise or not, it was a question mark and it was not addressed in any sort of meaningful way to give you an answer one way or the other. But let's just very quickly bring in Arun because I know that he has another big story that he's working on. So Arun, let me get wrap-up comments from you on what you see as the big challenges from what we've seen so far, and we've got a lot of reactions coming in from industry on how this is going to impact them.
I think I like to sum up some of these comments which really stood out for me. One from Mr. Drabu, the J&K finance minister, who said that we will look at a more modern distribution when it comes to classification. So he said luxury items, what was considered luxury items in the 60s or 70s, that those will not be the luxury items today. He gave the example of cell phone and smartphone. So that should soothe some nerves and should make a lot of citizens happy. Another point which Mr. Sridhar said, that the cess will be inflationary, and what will be the taxable event of that cess, and it will not be senvatable. They will not be able to take credit. That's a worry. From Mr. Pawan Goenka, I think what really stood out for me was his statement that GST is equal to excise plus VAT. So what he did not say in as many words was, so what is the new thing that we are getting? Of course, on the administrative side, probably a little more convenience and one single rate, better structure and so on. But that statement sums up what many are feeling. GST is equal to excise plus VAT. Where are we heading now? Two things. Number one, the turf war heads to the classification. All the industries are now going to be lobbying on where they fit in. You had the Dabur CEO saying that I do not know which of my items will fall in which tax bracket. So we are going to see a lot of lobbying from industry to say, hey, I am in the 12% tax bracket, I am in the 5% tax bracket, I am in the 18% tax bracket. You have Mr. Goenka saying that all SUVs are not luxury cars. So we are going to see a lot of lobbying from industry on the tax rate bracket. And last but not the least, the implementation. There has been a feeling in the government circles that the industry is not yet, gearing up for GST implementation, that they're probably not taking the seriously the April 1 deadline. I think it's going to be a mad rush to meet that deadline for many in the industry. At the top corporates, of course, the top 2,000, 5,000 corporates have the help of the consultants. But what about the million other, the SMEs, the small traders and all? So I think they really need to get geared up for implementation. Implementing this will not be easy. And that's why I said this is going to be a field day for the consultants.
Yep, I take Arun, I take your point completely, and the one consultant sitting next to me believes that the bigger problem is really going to come for services, which is not addressed at all. And believe you me, Mani, I've been getting constant plaints from bankers saying that they have no idea what is the administrative nightmare they're going to be in. I mean, if a credit card which is issued in Bombay is used in Calcutta for a good which was manufactured probably in Jaipur, where all do they have to register? How many sales tax registration numbers or GST tax registration numbers do they have to take? I mean, they are in for a mess. Can you clarify on the services front?
Yeah, sure. I think there are 3 points that I would like to make on services. The first is the fact that the entire GST discussion, and including what we have heard the finance minister saying today, all the eminent people speaking, all the news channels speaking, everyone is focused on goods, everyone is focused on cess, and everyone is focused largely on sin goods. As a country, we are largely a service-focused country. So we should be worried about services. You mentioned banking. In addition to banking, we should be worried about telecom. We should be worried about software. And in services sector also, there are millions of SMEs which provide services. What happens to all of them? So the first point that I would like to make is, strangely, in the entire GST debate, there has not been as much debate on services as is warranted, and that is something which possibly should start now. The second point I would like to make is that when we discuss goods, we talk of certain categories of goods as essentials, some as sin goods, and some as non-essential goods. We have not had that debate on services. Now, it could be because in the service tax regime that we have today, we have largely categorized all the goods as 15%, and we don't have a categorization of essential services and non-essential services, or sin services, so to say. But possibly in GST, since we have a 12 and we have an 18, and now we also have a 26, this is a time where we can break down services into 3 categories. So, and that leads me to the third point. You mentioned banking. In large parts of the developed world, banking services and telecom services are always taxed at a rate which is much lower than the rate applicable to most goods. So why can't we also in India think of the 12% rate applicable to the banking and telecom services, for instance, treating them as essential services? Tax many other services at possibly an 18%, and maybe there would be certain luxurious services which today gets taxed at 15, which can move up to 26. So essentially, there has been no debate as far as the service sector is concerned. That sector again requires a much larger time for preparation, because while the manufacturers are accustomed to a state level tax and a central level tax and grappling with both, the service sector largely is used to grappling only with one central tax. So for them, the preparation time, the lead time and all that is much, much more. And that is why I feel that there now needs to be a lot of focus on the services sector.
Fair point.
Hari, would you agree with that? Because Mani is absolutely right. You know, we've focused significantly, whether it's in the media or even the government's attention has so far been on goods, and there's been very little conversation on services.
Well, I don't know whether that's a correct statement. Media may have focused less on services, and that's because of the probable lack of understanding of what the complexity of services are. But I completely agree that banking, financial services, telecom and many other services, if they don't have a centralized registration concept in GST, are going to really go through the biggest pain. And that's something which in private interactions the government is acutely aware of. The problem is the states are not coming around to that, so that could be a huge point. And that still the jury is not out. As far as classifying services in sin category is something which is a bad idea, because as Mr. Drabu rightly pointed out, we are living in an aspirational society where this whole concept of luxury in an ad valorem concept itself should go on. So I don't think we should even go near that. Having said that, the government is definitely thinking along the lines of not all services being at 18, because today in the service tax category you have services which are essential or which they believe is essential, which is an abated category with an abatement. Some of those could be in 12. So that's something that I believe will be addressed, and in the conversations that I've had, there is a thinking along those lines. So services will be addressed in two categories. The question is how and what, and there will be some degree of debate on that. Centralized registration, in my view, is the biggest pain, and that's something that, yes, media has not picked up, but yes, people like us have been engaging very strongly either for the telecom or the financial services, trying to tell them about the complexities of what a nightmare it will be for the service sector in case there is no centralized registration. But what the unfortunate part is, I don't think the jury is out on that, and that's something which is really worrying the industry. And I allude to what Lata mentioned, the banking circle, the financial services, people are really worried about what's going to happen. Look at telecom. Telecom, surprisingly, look at telecom. Telecom regulatorily has to deal on circles. So the entire NCR is a circle. So for them, this whole concept of registration per state is going to be a nightmare. And it's going to be a nightmare for many MSME services. So that is an area which I believe there has been a lot of engagement at all levels. But what is concern is, I don't think there has been any response which has been alluding to a centralized registration. And without centralized registration, it could be a huge pain, huge pain. And as far as classification of services into sin category, I don't think we should even go near it, because that will open up Pandora's box. In my view, the whole category of sin, luxury in an aspirational society really is a dangerous topic to deal with.
Okay, let me quickly bring in a final word from Mr. J. Suresh as well. He's been patiently waiting by with us, the Managing Director and CEO of Arvind Lifestyle Brands. Our tax experts there were pointing out some of the pain points and the challenges that we are likely to face as we roll out the GST and move towards the GST. Mr. Suresh, what to your mind will be the big pain points on the back of what now has been finalized? Mr. Suresh? We seem to have lost them. Sachin, let me toss that question to you. We've just heard from Mani on the pain points, and Hari from EY has given us his pain points as well. Leave us with yours.
Well, you know, as regards the services are concerned, many of the services will have to be classified at lower rate. Because, for example, now petroleum products are out of GST, and that suffers almost about 55% taxes on an average in India. And this is an input for, say, for example, transportation services, for that matter. And if you have a uniform rate for all services, then the resultant, the immediate impact will be the inflation in the overall economy, because everything which you're talking about is requiring petroleum as a base, whether it's transportation, power, whatever. So therefore, there has to be a different treatment for many of the services, as Mani rightly said, that services which are required to be kept under the lower bracket of 5% or even exempted, for example, health services for that matter. So you need to have a preferential or differential treatment among services categories. If all the services are on 18%, then there is no question of service accounting code or a classification required, as mentioned in the manual, in the GST law. So it would have been, if all the rates are same, then there is no classification required except for the exemptions services. Now, coming to the other point is that many of the provisions of the GST law, which is lauded in favor of or only taking the goods into consideration, which has been framed only taking goods into consideration. For example, now those companies which are providing services using heavy equipment like oil exploration, oil and gas companies, using their seismic survey equipments costing about 100+ crores of value. If they have to transfer this equipment to another state, send the equipment to another state for doing a seismic survey, and if you apply the GST law today and say that on the value of this you have to pay GST because it is an interstate self-supply, then no company will do such kind of service using the heavy equipments. For example, even for broadcasting scenario, if somebody has to take maybe the camera equipment to another state, for example, it is NCR region, and you have to pay taxes, that is not practical. So you need to reorient this law in line with what is practical and which is possible under the law, because otherwise it is going to head towards a disaster. Especially those companies using the leased assets for providing leasing services, if you have to pay tax on that, on the supply of goods which are used for lease services, then the lease industry will completely has to close down. So there are issues with reference to services specifically. It is time for government to think about it and come out with a specific exception, exclusions on some of the rules, which is some of the provisions which is now proposed in the model GST law.